Even with the scariest of mysteries, the most simple answer is usually the correct one. But in these solved mysterious cases, the answers are much stranger than expected. Number 5. It's not surprising that Hollywood has its fair share of con artists and crooks looking to make money from people trying to find their way in show business. But one of the biggest cons in recent years became a strange mystery that was only solved in 2020. The victims were hairstylists, makeup artists, stuntmen, photographers, and just about anybody who had ambitions of working behind the scenes in Hollywood. An unknown individual would play on those ambitions, take the victims halfway around the world, and steal thousands of dollars at a time. The person who was the voice of the con became known as the Hollywood Con Queen, but her identity was something none of the investigators had been expecting. The con started out in 2015, targeting makeup artists in the UK. Eventually, it would spread to the US, where there were more victims to be had. Typically, the con queen would contact the victim via email, pretending to be a high-profile female director or movie executive. Stacey Snider from 20th Century Fox and Lucasfilm's president, Kathleen Kennedy, were among those who were impersonated. The con artist would call the victim and discuss an upcoming project she was allegedly working on, which she wanted the victim's help with. In every case, the voice on the other end of the phone was almost indistinguishable from the real person who was being impersonated. The gig always involved the victim flying out to Indonesia, paying for their own flights, and handing over money for drivers and other expenses in the Southeast Asian country. The con artist would assure her victim they would be reimbursed at a later date. This was typical for freelance workers, so it didn't set off any alarm bells. But when the workers got to Indonesia, the people collecting the money would seem pushy, and the con artist would keep assuring the victim that their big break was just around the corner. Many of the victims tried to go to the FBI, but the amount of money they had lost wasn't enough for authorities to get involved. In the end, it was the people being impersonated that had to hire private investigators to locate the scammer. The woman was never seen in person, but one of the victims had seen the passport of one of the people who supposedly worked on her behalf, a man calling himself Anand Sippy, a film producer. When a copy of the passport was sent to investigators, they were able to recognize the man as Hargaban Tahil Ramani. Tahil Ramani was an Indonesian man in his 40s living in the UK. He claimed to be a food influencer, but his interactions with people in the industry were mixed. Some found him to be charming. Others had been sent abusive, hateful messages when he wasn't put on their press lists for their opening events. He also worked with photographers and had not paid them. It would turn out that Tahil Ramani was actually the alleged Hollywood con queen herself. He was exceptionally good at impersonations, though why he chose to impersonate women in particular isn't clear. He had previously been in prison in Indonesia for fraud, where he had come under the protection of another con artist who helped him develop his skills. When news of the Hollywood con queen first broke, people speculated that it must have been someone in the industry. A disgruntled former makeup artist or assistant made the most sense. But this was far from the truth. Tahil Ramani had never worked in the film industry and was the last person anyone expected to be behind such a strange case. Tahil Ramani is currently awaiting extradition to the US. Number 4. For almost a decade, residents in the Canadian town of Windsor were plagued by a strange mystery that didn't seem like it would ever be solved. A low-pitch but loud sound could be heard throughout the city. It was a hum that was as much of a vibration as an audible noise. It shook window panes, made dogs and other animals panic, and disturbed the sleep of residents. The Windsor Hum, as it came to be known, was a mystery. It would stop and start seemingly at random. Sometimes the hum could be heard for hours, sometimes it would last days. Thousands of residents reported hearing the noise, and physical evidence of the shaking it produced proved this wasn't an auditory hallucination. Investigators from the University of Windsor even managed to capture the hum on tape, but finding the source of the noise wouldn't be that easy. Conspiracy theories about the noise began to spread. Some suggested it was a secret weapon or something to do with outer space. Others suggested the military was digging for some unknown reason. Researchers thought the source of the noise was much more mundane, but they couldn't be certain what it was. Windsor lies close to the border with the US, with only the Detroit River between them. Located in the river is Zug Island. Zug Island is a heavy industrialized island, with steelworks among the businesses set up there. Researchers believed the steelworks might be responsible for the hum, but couldn't be sure. Zug Island is located in the US, and the investigators could not get permission to visit, so the mystery could be solved once and for all. What was most surprising about this case is that it was solved at all. Finally, in 2020, the US steel factory on the island shut down, and with the shutdown came something Windsor residents had thought they would never hear again: silence. The Windsor Hum had been caused by a blast furnace at the factory, one of the few things that would have been able to create so much energy that the hum could be heard so far away. It's unlikely the factory will begin operating again, so it seems the Windsor Hum is gone for good and the mystery is finally over. Number 3. During the Cold War, anything unknown was a potential risk. Sometimes extremely mundane things like weather balloons and sunlight reflecting off of clouds has led to the world coming close to a nuclear confrontation. But in the 1980s and 90s, something much stranger was puzzling the Swedish Navy. Even though Sweden was neutral during the Cold War, Soviet submarines were sometimes found to stray into Swedish waters. It all came to a head in 1981. When a Whiskey-class submarine became stranded on a rocky outcrop not far from a Swedish naval base. It became known as the Whiskey on the Rock incident. According to Russians aboard the submarine, a navigation problem had led them to stray into Swedish waters and land on the rock. How true that was, the Swedes may never be able to determine, but a scan of the submarine led them to believe it may have been armed with nuclear weapons. The Swedish Navy assisted the submarine back into international waters. Now the military had proof that Soviet submarines had been invading their waters. The paranoia reached a new extreme. For years after the incident, the military had people listening for signs of underwater activity that could be a threat. Sounds that could not be explained were surprisingly common, and the military sent boats, submarines, and helicopters to search for the source of the sounds. No enemy submarines were ever found, just a few bubbles on the surface of the water. Even after the Cold War ended, the strange sounds, which earned the nickname typical sounds, continued to be detected. They were classed as highly important, and it was thought they represented a real threat against the nation. The Soviet Union, and then Russia, continued to deny it had any submarines in the area. And the Swedish minister accused the Russian president of having a poor control over its navy. In the end, in 1996, the Navy had to bring in civilian scientists to try to solve the problem. Given 15 years of searching for a submarine hadn't solved this mystery, the scientists tried to come up with another explanation. One suggestion was that it might have been a form of sediment that released gas, but this was ruled out. The scientists' attention turned to animals. The Baltic herring is an extremely common fish in that area, and they swim in huge shoals that can be kilometers in size. The scientists found that when the fish were squeezed underwater, they released gas. With thousands of fish swimming together, it was possible this sound would register on military equipment. The sound of the gas being released was the same as the mysterious typical sounds that the military had been trying to solve for more than a decade. With the mystery solved, the military adjusted their techniques for searching for Russian submarines and found the waters around Sweden to be remarkably quiet. Number 2. When a Los Angeles radio station breakfast show began a new segment encouraging listeners to confess their crimes, nobody listening expected it would be the subject of a scary unsolved mystery. In June of 1990, DJs Kevin Ryder and Gene Baxter entertained listeners during the morning commute on K-Rock FM. They had just come up with a new segment that would run weekly. Listeners would call in to confess their crimes, such as stealing bowling balls from the local bowling alley or cheating on their spouse. The DJs would make jokes about the confessions, and it was supposed to be a lighthearted way for people to get their secrets off their chest. Things took a much darker tone on June 13th. A male caller contacted the show. He sounded nervous and described his crime as something that had happened years ago in another city. The man said he had been dating a woman for 6 years, and he was considering marrying her when he discovered her in bed with his best friend. The DJs expected him to say that he had gone out and trashed her car and let the caller continue. He actually confessed to physically attacking his wife, though. When the DJ asked if he had thought he could have taken her life, he said that he knew he could have. The DJs were in shock. They tried to get the man to stay on the line so that they could get him help, but he quickly hung up, so they cut to a commercial. They were then inundated with callers who wanted more information, who thought the whole thing was a joke, or who thought the DJs hadn't taken the callers seriously enough. It wasn't long before the police got involved. There was a possibility this was a hoax, though both Ryder and Baxter denied that it was a hoax that they were in on. The previous year, another radio show in the area had been the victim of a hoax call where employees at Edward Air Force Base pretended to have a domestic dispute over the phone. But this was much more serious, and police believed there was a possibility it was genuine. Copies of the call were sent to other police departments, as the caller said the crime had taken place in another city. Finding out who the victim was would be the first step to identifying the caller. The creepy confession even appeared on Unsolved Mysteries as police tried to figure out what the crime was. All the while, Ryder and Baxter denied being involved. It was suspected the caller might have been referring to a case that had happened a few months earlier, where police hadn't been able to find enough evidence that the boyfriend had been involved in that particular case. The truth would come out in April of the following year. The caller had been a hoax. The man on the other end of the line was Doug Roberts, another DJ who had since been hired by K-Rock. Ryder and Baxter were both in on the joke, having concocted the plan with Robert months before the segment even began. They had supposedly started the whole thing to boost ratings. Amazingly, they were only taken off the air for a few days before K-Rock allowed the 3 DJs to continue working. They did have to pay for the investigation that their hoax had caused, though, and did community service helping the homeless. Number 1. After a drifter named Connie Franklin disappeared in 1929, none of the town's residents could have expected how the mystery would be solved. Franklin arrived in the rural Arkansas town of St. James in January of 1929. He never stayed in one place for long enough to set down roots, but in St. James, he met a young woman named Tiller Ruminer, and the two were quickly engaged to be married. On March 9th, they traveled to the office of the Justice of the Peace to get a license to marry, but when Ruminer returned a few days later, she returned alone. What had happened to Franklin remained a mystery for 8 months. Ruminer refused to talk about the events of that night, and most assumed he had disappeared into the night, as he had likely done countless times before. It wasn't until a woman named Bertha Burns found a hat belonging to Franklin with stains that indicated that the man had come to harm that Ruminer told her story. Allegedly, 4 men had ambushed them and attacked Franklin. Fire had been used to dispose of his body. Burns encouraged Ruminer to go to the authorities. The 4 men Ruminer had accused were self-appointed moral enforcers in the area and were led by a man named Alex Fulks. Fulks hadn't been named by Ruminer as one of the men, but he was arrested along with them. The local people were extremely angry about the horrific crimes that were said to have taken place. Police feared that they would take action into their own hands before a trial could be set up, so the men were kept in separate prisons for their own protection. When the trial began, the prosecution pointed to some charred bones, which they claimed were all that remained of Franklin. Medical examiners couldn't be certain that the bones belonged to someone of Franklin's height or size, because key bones were missing. The defense insisted they didn't belong to Franklin because he was still alive. A man claiming to be Franklin was the defense's star witness. He claimed he, his would-be wife, and the 4 accused men had been drinking the night that he vanished. He fell off his mule and injured himself. The next day, Ruminer had wanted to postpone the wedding. He had told her that they would marry today or she would never see him again. When she insisted on waiting, he left. Whether this was actually Franklin became the big question of the case. Photography wasn't exactly common in rural Arkansas, and Ruminer insisted that this wasn't the man that she had wanted to marry. However, others who had known him before the alleged vanishing claimed that this was Franklin. The case took another twist when a medical examiner revealed that this was actually a man named Marion Rogers. Rogers had been enlisted in the Army years earlier, but had only served 5 days before being sent to a mental institution. He'd escaped the hospital in 1927, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. The jury couldn't be sure that this wasn't Franklin, though, and the men accused of taking his life were found not guilty. It wasn't the outcome of the case anybody had expected when the trial began. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.